Hello and welcome for another tutorial in .NET Core and resource files. So what are resource files? Resource files basically allow you to embed um, uh, types from strings to images or even objects inside of a file that's considered a resource file. And then this resource file can either be standalone because it's a non-executable, or it could be embedded within either an executable or an assembly. And we'll take a look at how are these things done. And one of the ways that the resource file can be used is, for example, if you're localizing your application so that maybe it's multilingual and you want to keep the English labels different from maybe French or German or some other language. So you could use that. And we'll take a look at how you can create these resources, how you embed them within your assembly or executable. And you can also look into package resources, which is considered satellite assemblies. We'll look at those as well. Now, there in the previous .NET framework, there was this tool called ResGen.exe that would create resource files for you. And we'll take a look at that. And then we can also look into programmatically reading and writing resource files, whether you're inside the application or if the resource is outside. All right, let's get to it. So here I've created a Visual Studio C# console project with .NET Core, and I've removed the sample code in here. So what we're going to do is we're going to create resource files using Visual Studio. Then what will happen is that when you compile your project, Visual Studio will use MS Build to actually embed your resource file. So let's just go ahead and create the resource file so you can see what it actually looks like. So we'll create by saying add new item. And then once you're given this dialog, as you can see, I've already selected the resource file. So it's going to be creating this resource1.resx as the extension for it. But if you couldn't find it, you can always come in here and type resource, and it should navigate and find the resource file for you. So we'll just keep the default name and click add. So once you add this, you'll notice now that you have a UI that displays what you can put inside a resource file. Now this resource file actually has a designer code behind which you can open, and it is dynamically generated. So you don't want to mess around with this, but if you have to create your own, for example, then you can use this as an example, create your own file, and then put this code inside to do that. Now, everything you do inside of this will actually go and generate the code behind in here for the designer for us. The thing with this is also that if you notice that the access modifier is set to internal. So if I go back in here, you'll notice that everything is set for internal. If I come back and then decide to make this public and save this, and then we go back to the resource designer, you'll notice now it became public. So you can access all of these from even outside of the assembly. The other thing is that if you were to right click on this and go to the properties, you'll notice that it says do not copy, but it also says build action embed resource. This is what I was talking about with MS Build, that would actually go read this and see that this file is a that needs to be embedded, and then it would actually embed this within our application. So let's go ahead. So right now, if you look at this UI part, it has a string value and it has a name, so it's basically keep here, and you can have some value in here. And then you can have a comment. And you can add multiple strings because the name can be used as a key, so you want to make sure those are unique. If you don't want to put anything else, you'll notice there's nothing in there. So we can go ahead and save that. Now if you come in over here, you have a bunch of other buttons, and if you click on this, you'll notice that right now we're looking at adding strings in here. And you can go in here and add images. Or you can go add icons, and you can go add audio files. You can actually embed additional files inside of this, or you can go other and just add the resource, whether it be an existing file or whatever. So if you wanted to do images, you can also come in here and add existing or create a new image. and add it in there. So these are the different types of data that you can add in. So now that we have this, let's go ahead and save this and let's do a build. There we go. So I guess this CS file needs to have something, otherwise the compiler will have an issue. So now that we build our assembly, what I can do is I can open up my trusty ILSpy to look at inside of my assembly to see what I have inside of that. So let's actually go to our bin directory and copy the full path, come over here, and now we have our executable and the resource file. Now if you open the resource file, the executable, this is just a pointer to the actual assembly where it has the code. So let's actually do that so you can see. You'll notice that it's not able to decompile this. So let's go ahead and remove that and go back and open our DLL, and this is the one that actually has the code. So if you open this, you'll notice now that the compiler was able to go get some metadata, some debug information. You have the references, what references are included as part of this project, and then you have this folder that has resources. So here is our resource, and the way it's named is that the namespace dot resource1.resources. So this is the actual name. The extension used to be regex, but now it's been changed to resources. So if you were to open this, now you can see that you have your string name and the value of that key. But you notice that you don't have the comment in here. So this comment is really more for within Visual Studio to look and understand what this key and value is for. So this comment is just for you, but it is not going to be compiled within the assembly. Now that you have this, let's take a look at how you can access this. Well, if you go into the resource file, you have this resource1.designer. So within your program, you should be able to access that, right? Because all you have to do is go within this resource file and then get the string 1. Now, if we take this and put it inside the console.writeline and save it, and let's go ahead and execute this, we should see some value coming back out of that. So this is great. Now, what are other ways you can access this? There are some internal assemblies that can help you access the resources. Now, let's say, for example, you got an assembly from someone and you wanted to iterate through all of these resources to see what resources are available within that. So how would you do that? So the way to do that is we would actually create an assembly class, and let's call this just assembly, and get the executing assembly. Now, instead of loading the assembly, now we already in our executing assembly, so just I'm going to use that. You can actually come in here and actually load an assembly and then get the assembly's metadata information. So now that we have the current executing assembly, we're going to now go find what kind of resources are available for us. Now, to do that, what we need to do is use a using statement, and the reason for this is because now I'm going to extract the stream from this. And to do that, I'm going to have to create a stream object, and let's call this stream. And let's say now from my assembly, and I am going to get the manifest resource stream. Now notice now here I can actually have the name of my resource if I knew what it was. Well, if you went over here, we know now that the resource name is this over here. So now if I come over here and put that in there, this will be read from that manifest within the file. And then what we can do here is create a resource reader and put the stream inside of it. And then within this, what we can do is create a for loop. And then this for each loop is going to have a big dictionary entry. And we'll take the reader as the dictionary. And then the next thing what we want to do is we want to do a console.writeLine. We want to have the key, and then we want to do the same thing for console.writeLine key value. And let's go ahead and comment this out because we don't want to get confused with the details of that. And now if we run this, we should have the key and then the value coming back. Now we said that we're going to figure this out if I didn't know what was in here. Let's put this actually in a method. Let's go ahead and cut this. There we go. And then let's actually create another method because we need to separate this out and then get resources. Oops. So this way I can keep these separate, and then I'll check in the source code to my repo so you guys can actually get the file and play around with it. So we said that we're going to change this to get manifest. Right, so now we're going to call this, this is going to be string array of resources. Actually, this is going to be assembly, and then we're going to use disassembly. And this is why it wasn't working, and I wasn't quite sure why. Okay, so now that we have this, we don't need to get this, and what we need to do now is do a loop of the resources to get the names. And this one is going to be a string, and this is going to be resource, and all we're going to do is output the, there we go. So, and then let's go ahead and have this over here and execute this. So now you can see the resources. If you had multiple resources, it would outline them. So this is how you can go then identify the resource, and then inside of this, for example, you could then get the resource here. So let's actually extend this so we can say string resource name, and then pass that over here. So that would work. And because we already have the assembly in here, you could probably pass this as well. So you can then say the assembly, and then take this. We don't need this anymore. And there we go. So now everything should work if we were to actually call this assembly. All right, so this is how you can actually get the resources. Now, what are some of the other ways you can do this? Well, one of the things we talked about was that you could have a resource that could have not just some values, but you could put some additional information like images, icons, and other files. So let's go ahead and add maybe an image and a file, and then see how we can extract that. So we'll go ahead and do that next. Okay, so now here we are. I actually went into the resource and I added an image, and which you can see here, and then I also added a file, which is a JSON file, and if we open this, you'll see that it's a simple JSON file in there. Now I'm able to see this because the Visual Studio understands this, and if we go to the images section, you can see that this is also an image. Now the reason Visual Studio is able to understand this is because the resx files has all the data that we need. Also, by adding these, Visual Studio created a folder and actually it added the JSON file and it added the image in here for me. So why is it then I'm able to see this in the resx file? To better understand this, we need to open the resx files into an editor. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and open this, and then I'm going to go to the resx files, and I am going to open this with Visual Studio Code. And if you open this, notice that this is actually an XML file. It has all the information that I need. So here's a bit of comments, so you can actually comment this out. Here we have the XSD. We're going to go ahead and close that as well. If you wanted to understand the XSD and how the schema stuff works, go see my tutorial about that. The rest of them is actually XML, and these are basically the information about this is being text, and this is the version, and this is the actual reader that is going to be used to read, and then this is the writer that is used for this resx files. There's also a reference to the system windows.form. But if you look over here, you'll notice that this is actually the folder, and then this is the file that we have. And what it's going to do is it's going to use system byte, and it's going to use our mscore lib, which is where the type is going to be, and that is what it's going to use. So and then of course you have your string here. So when we go to the Visual Studio and we actually compile this, the resource is compiled. So let's go over here, and we're going to go ahead and reload this. And now if we go look at our resources, we see our resources, we have our resource file, which shows our string. But if you expand this, then we have our JSON file, and then we have our key. But the key is, you're not able to see this. And the reason you're not able to see is that the information that is being put into the resource file, it's basically binary. It's a byte array, so it's not going to know. So if you come in here to your Visual Studio again and look at the code behind for this, you'll notice that there's two additional values here. So we have our key and the JSON file that is in here. So we use a get object, which gets an object and it converts it to a byte array, and that is what you're getting back. So if we were to go in here and we were to ask for the key or the JSON file, so we go resource 1, and then if we were to go to the key, now this key is going to be a byte array. So we would have to then convert this to something in order to understand what it is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create actually a new method to find out if this is an image or if it's something else. Now, to do that, we actually would need to go to our package manager, and we need to add system.drawing. So I'm going to take system.drawing. I'm going to go ahead and install that. So now that it's been installed, I'll go back to my code behind, and I'm going to create a method, and let's call this is valid image. And then what it's going to accept is going to be a byte array, and it's going to, let's just call this bytes. And this is going to return either true or false. So now to make sure that this doesn't throw exceptions, we're going to go ahead and use a try and catch. And so for the catch, let's just actually try the, actually just go here and just say this is false. Or we can just return true actually here. Then inside of this, instead of throw an exception, let's actually return false. And then inside of this, what we're going to do is going to use using stream memory stream. Now for the memory stream, we can pass it a byte array. So we'll go ahead and use our bytes. And then in here, what we're going to do is we're going to use the image from system.drawing, and we're going to say from stream and pass it the memory stream inside of this. So this is going to check to see if this is an image or not. So now what we can do is we can say if is valid image by taking the resource and key, and then you could do something. Actually, let's just do console.write line and say key is image, right? So let's go ahead and run this to see if this is actually true. And key is image. So this is how you could go read that and find out if this is an image or not. Let's actually look at something here. When we were actually reading the resource reader, we use the class that's resource reader. But when we were looking at this in the resx file, the resource reader is not really a reader. It's actually a resx resource reader. And why is this the way it is versus writer, right? And the reason for this is because this is actually using the .NET framework rather than .NET Core. Our project is in .NET Core, so that's what we are using. Then how is it Visual Studio is able to work with this? Well, Visual Studio actually uses a executable called resx. And so to kind of illustrate that, let's actually copy these two over to temp directory. I actually already have it, but I'm going to copy it anyway and overwrite this stuff. And so here's my designer, my resx file, and my folder. And what I'm going to do is go ahead and run. First, I need to navigate to the program files where the .NET Framework 4.8 tools are. And inside of that, I have this resgen.exe. That's the executable that can create resource files. Then I pass it my resource file. Now, if I run this, I should get an error. And the reason it's going to get an error is going to say that the JSON file, the path wasn't found. And the reason it's not able to find the path for this is because if you were to open this, it's actually navigating to where the executable is and then look for a resource path. So you could try to figure this out by keep going one level up. But what I'm going to do instead, because I already know where this is, I'm just going to say it's in my temp folder and give it the direct access path. So now that I've did this, and let's go ahead and rerun this. And now it actually went and created a resource file. So if we were to go back in here, notice now it created this resource file. So if we were to go back to our Visual Studio and try to read that resource file, we should get the same exact information that we did before. So let's go ahead and come down here and write the code that is going to load the resource file and then read the information from it. So what I'm going to do is let's go ahead and create a new method. And in this one, we're just going to keep this as void, and we're going to say read resource file. And I'm going to pass it a string for file path. And then in here, I'm going to say using file stream, and keep this as file stream equals to, and then we're going to say file that open read the file path, right? So next, we're going to use the resource reader. And so let's go ahead and use the resource reader and use the stream to read And then what we're going to do here is create a var enumerator. And we're going to set this as the reader dot get enumerator. And then we're going to loop. And we're going to have our string name. And we're going to have our object value. And this should be value. And then let's do a console dot write line. And instead of doing that, let's actually do plus plus. Kind of like this. There we go. So now let's go ahead and call our resource method. And so this is going to be c:\temp, and the name of it is going to be resource1.resources. I believe that's correct. Let's go back here, check really quick. Let's just copy that name. Okay. And let's comment this out as well. All right, let's run this. There we go. So we have a string of some value. We have a key, which is a system byte, and of course we can't see its data. And then we have a JSON file, which is also a byte array, which we have a byte array. So far we've been working on reading resource files. What we're going to do now is actually start writing to the resource files everything that we've done. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually copy the JSON file. I'm going to just put it into the folder. And the next thing I'm going to do is, the reason I did that is because it makes it easier to read the file without having to pass a path and everything, because it'll read it from wherever the executable is. The next thing what I'm going to do is use the resource writer. And let's just call this resource writer. And in here you can either pass a stream, so you could open a file and a stream, or you can pass the file name. And in this one I'm going to pass the file name, which is basically our JSON file name. Well, actually, since we are writing, this won't be part of that. And let's actually make this resource2.resources. Okay. Next, what we need to do is actually read the file in an array. So we're going to create a byte array, except we're going to just not call this buffer. Let's just call this bytes. And then here we're just going to use the file object, and we're going to say read all bytes. And now we're going to pass the JSON file. So the JSON file .json. Okay. Next, what we need to do is take the resource writer, and let's just add a resource. And here we're just going to add a string resource. So I'm going to just say username, and then a value for that. It's going to be max. And then next, what we want to do is actually now add our resource file. So to do that, we have a method for resource data. Now you could actually use the add resource because you can pass it not just strings, we can pass it objects and other file formats. So for now, let's just keep it like this, and I will go over JSON file, and then here you can tell it what to pass. So this will be system.byte array. I believe this is capitalized. And then this is going to be the byte array file, so it's going to be bytes. Okay. So now let's take a look at the adding a resource. So if you say add resource, you could have done this where we can say, okay, this is going to be a file name, or excuse me, the key of the resource, and then here you could have chosen one of these, either a stream value, an object, a string, stream value with a closed after write. So you can have pretty much anything in there as well. But this makes it a little bit easier to know that you're adding a file object inside of this, or maybe an image. So now that we added that, what we need to do next is actually generate the data, and this actually will flush the stream. And then we're going to go ahead and close the resource writer. So now that we closed it, what we can do is now we're going to go ahead and use the file stream to read the resource file that it generated for us. So now we're going to say equals file dot open read, and this is going to be the same name as the file we created. So when we need to generate this, actually will compile a binary file of the type resources. And now that we have read our file, we are going to create a resource reader, and it's going to take our file stream. And next, what we're going to do is take our reader or resource reader, and now we are going to get the resource data. And this is going to have a few values. So the first one is going to be our JSON file. This is going to be the key that we are looking for. And then we're going to use an out string of resource type. So this will be resource type. I'm going to create, instead of having a variable and then passing this out, I'm just going to use the out with a var. So this actually becomes our variable to use later on. And I'm going to do the same thing over here. So now we're going to use the resource data. So that should get our, and this method is void. So this should get our resource data, and this should get our type. So based on the type, then you can choose how to open the file. So we already know that this is going to be a string. So what I'm going to do is create a var str for the variable name, and let's just use the system dot text dot encoding utf-it, and then get the string out of this binary data. And let's just do a console.write line, but let's put a breakpoint on this to see if this will work. Let's go ahead and we're going to run this. Let's actually stop here, run this. So that should have written our file. So if we go back here and open the file, you'll notice that we have our resource2 resources file in there. So now we're gonna read the stream add that into the reader, and then you're going to get resource data to pull that information. So now this is going to come out as the binary data, and this is going to be our type that came out. So then you can look at this and see what you wanted to do, and this is the method that's going to convert this byte array into a string. And if you look at this, you'll see that we have our JSON file and a string type. And so that's how you can actually have the file created programmatically using C#. So the next thing we're going to take a look at is to see how to use the resources when it comes to localization. Technically, you could say globalization because you can have currency, date, as well as the text. So let's say you want to greet the user, but you want to greet them in the language that is suitable to them. And how would you do that? Well, the first thing you got to do is you need to go and set up some values. So I created two resources. First, I created my English US and French France. So if you look at these, I didn't translate these, but I did put FR in here so that you can see this is coming from the right place. So the key is still hello, and then in the English one is also hello, but the values are different. So what we can do now is go into the programs file and write code so that it would get it. And how would you do that? The way to do this is you would use Resource Manager, and something we haven't used. So far we use Resource Writer and Resource Reader, but actually you have seen Resource Manager, and that is when we went to our Resource 1, we looked at the designer. And the designer, it created a bunch of code for us. And this code was really internally so that it could use it exposes it to you guys so you could use it. And if you look over here, it's creating a resource manager, and it generates a resource manager, and then it uses this resource manager to access other parts of the resource file. So here we have the resource manager, and it gets an object by getting the file. Here we have the resource manager by getting the key, and here we're getting string 1. And it does that because it calls this method, or excuse me, this property called resource manager. So this resource manager is being used here. Inside of the get, we're doing the construction and returning the object back. So we could do the same thing. So what we can do here is then call resource manager. Well, we'll have to set up a resource manager, and let's call it resource manager equal to resource manager. Now the next thing it's going to need is it needs to know where the resources are and the types that it needs to work with. It also needs the executing assembly, but if you didn't have the assembly and you wanted to get the assembly from someplace else, you could then actually load that assembly and then pass the assembly object in here. So what we're going to do is we're going to set these two. First, we're going to set the name. The name is basically the namespace. So our namespace is going to be the name of our project. And then it's going to be the name of the resource. In this case, we call our strings. And then the next thing we need to do is pass the assembly. Because this is being built as part of our project, what we have to do is get the executing assembly. So we can say assembly dot executing assembly, and that should satisfy this requirement. So now we have a resource manager. In the resource manager, now we can say get string, and we call ours hello. And let's go ahead and actually write this to the console. Now if you run it this way, you're gonna see the hello, but how does it actually get the user's language? So what we could do is, for example, say if the arguments being passed And if its length is, let's say, greater than 0, then we're going to set the culture info. And we're going to set this to be the culture info of whatever the arguments, the first argument that was being passed. And we should call this new, otherwise it won't work. There we go. Next, we're going to then take the current thread. So we're going to say thread, because this is a console application, so that it only has one. And we're going to get the current thread and set the current culture to be our culture. And if we had a UI, we could then also get the current culture of that as well. So for now, we'll just do both of them to satisfy the requirement, but it doesn't need to be because we only have one, and that should suffice. So now if we run this, because my computer is set up to be as English, it's already going to have a culture that is English using en-us. So it's going to go to this resource to get the hello and display it. But then how do you get this one? Then we can actually modify this so that it actually has a value. So if currently we run this, we should get our English one, because that's what it's going to default, whatever the default computer is in the current culture. So if we were to go over here and run this again, and then let's go to see if we can find our current culture. And let's go to so if I output the current culture, as you can see, it's en-us, and that is how it's able to do that. Now, let's go ahead, before writing this out, what we can do is set the argument to be, so we can set the args to be string 1, because we're only going to have one. And this is going to be fr-fr. Now let's set this to fr-fr. Okay. So now that we set that, if we hit F10, now we can see that this is going to go in, and now it's going to use the fr to create the current culture, and then it's going to set the current culture. And now if we go back to looking at our current culture, as you can see now, it's set to fr-fr. So now we should see the French version being displayed to the console. So you can have all your resources in here, and then it would actually set that correctly for you. So now let's take a look at what Visual Studio does to generate these resource files, especially if they're localized. If we go to the bin directory and then debug and open our the .NET 7 folder where our files are, you'll notice now that you have a folder for en-us and one for fr-fr. So if you open this, you'll notice now that you have these two assemblies. They're named exactly the same, but they're different folders. And so now if you open up your ILSpy, and let's go ahead and navigate to our bin directory. So if I was to take this assembly and open it, you'll notice now that it has my resource associated to it in the resource, but there's really nothing else inside of this. It is just a assembly with a resource associated here. And if I do the same thing for the FR one, it'll be the same thing. So when you're building Visual Studio will create a folder for each one of your languages, and it will add it in there. This is important because when you're doing deployment, make sure that you capture your folders as part of your deployment asset and have it set up so that when you're deploying, they should be in the folder where the executable is. So if our executable resides in a folder A, in that folder A, you need to have both of these resources associated to that so that it can find that. And these are called satellite assemblies. Thank you for joining me for this tutorial. We'll see you next time.